On a humid night in Brazil's rural interior, long before his name became a whispered warning, a boy no older than 14 stood beneath a flickering street lamp, staring at the man who had once beaten his mother. The town around them slept, but the air seemed to hold its breath, sensing a shift in the balance of fear. In that quiet corner of the world, violence was a language, and young Pedro Rodrigues Filho was about to speak it for the first time. It would be a sentence the country would never forget. People who later crossed paths with Pedrinho Matador said his eyes could measure a person's truth faster than words could explain it. He had a way of looking at someone that felt less like a glance and more like a verdict. But on that night, before the newspapers and the legends, he was simply a boy pushed too close to the edge, a boy shaped by bruises, betrayal, and a household where cruelty hung in the air like smoke. 3. Nothing about his childhood gave him a place to run. The walls that should have protected him instead taught him the rhythm of screams. The streets that should have offered escape showed him predators wearing the faces of ordinary men. And as each injustice carved deeper into him, a strange logic began to grow. A belief that the world could be corrected, not with forgiveness, but with retribution. When the first gunshot echoed across the sleepy neighborhood, no one realized they were hearing the birth of a figure who would haunt Brazil's history for decades. The boy who pulled the trigger felt something shift inside him, not triumph, but clarity. The cold certainty that he had done what no one else dared. This is not the tale of a hero, nor is it a simple descent into darkness. It is the story of a life forged at the border between victim and executioner. The story of a child twisted into a legend, feared by criminals and authorities alike. This is the beginning of Pedrinho Matador, the boy who believed justice could bloom from violence, and the man who made that belief his legacy. Pedro Rodrigues Filho, known across Brazil as Pedrinho Matador, is a name wrapped in contradiction. To some, he became a vigilante, hunting men who preyed on the weak. To others, he was nothing more than a relentless killer who believed his own fury could balance the scales of an unjust world. But the truth, as always, lives somewhere in the middle. His story isn't about glory or righteousness. It's about survival inside a place where the law often failed before it even began. In this narrative journey, we'll travel through the landscapes that shaped him. The violent household where he learned to fear the man meant to protect him, the small town where he committed his first killing before turning 15, and the chaotic prisons where he transformed from a boy fueled by revenge into a man carved by brutality. Pedrinho's path is a map of Brazil's forgotten margins, places where justice is too slow, where the poor have no shield, and where violence breeds itself like a second language. Before we begin this deep dive, I want to invite you to support this channel. These long-form investigations take time, research, and dedication, and your engagement helps keep this storytelling alive. So if you're new here, subscribe, hit the like button, and help this documentary reach more people who love true crime history told with accuracy and cinematic depth. And in the comments below, tell me which country and city you're watching from. It's always incredible to see how far these stories travel around the world. Now settle in. The life of Pedrinho Matador is more than a chronicle of violence. It's a window into the shadows that shaped him, the choices that defined him, and the world that pushed him to become one of the most infamous figures Brazil has ever known. A house built on fear, Pedro Rodrigues Filho entered the world already marked by violence. His mother carried the bruise of a kick when she gave birth to him, a blow delivered by his father during one of many drunken rages. Doctors would later say the blow damaged the young Pedro's skull, leaving a small indentation that he would feel under his fingers for the rest of his life. That hollow space became a symbol, a physical reminder that his life began with pain long before he had words to describe it. The household where Pedro grew up was a place where fear never slept. His father ruled with fists, where silence was safer than breath, and where the smallest mistake could ignite an eruption of violence. Pedro learned early that adults could not be trusted, and that authority did not guarantee protection. The home that should have nurtured him instead became a classroom of cruelty. Children adapt to their environment in ways adults cannot comprehend. Pedro learned to read danger by the sound of footsteps, the rhythm of his father's breathing, the slightest shift in tone. Survival sharpened him. It made him watchful. It taught him that kindness was fragile, but anger was reliable. Anger was honest. As he grew older, Pedro found refuge outside the house, wandering dirt roads and alleyways where he could observe the world without the constant threat of being struck. But even outside, safety was an illusion. Crime seeped through the neighborhoods. Petty thieves, corrupt men, drunks who settled arguments with knives. It was a world where the law arrived too late or never arrived at all. It didn't take long for Pedro to understand that the society around him operated on a different set of rules. Strength was currency. Weakness was opportunity. He watched men who hurt others walk freely. He saw victims cry without justice. And in his young mind, a belief began to grow. If the world refused to punish the wicked, then someone else would have to. The tipping point came when a school dispute escalated into something much darker. Rumors spread that a cafeteria employee had been stealing food and blaming Pedro's father, who worked security for the small school. The accusation turned into tension, and soon Pedro's father lost his job. To Pedro, this wasn't merely unfair. It was an attack on the only person he had ever seen stand between him and complete chaos. Many boys would have complained, some would have cried. Pedro did neither. Instead, he spent days watching the man who made the accusation, studying his routine with the cold focus of someone far older than 14. His rage wasn't impulsive. It was methodical, rooted in a sense of twisted justice. When the moment arrived, it came without ceremony. The schoolworker walked down a quiet street at dusk, unaware of the boy who followed him. Pedro approached him with determination, not trembling, not hesitating. What happened next would shock the community. A teenager confronting an adult with a level of violence no one believed possible. The incident ended quickly, but its consequences rippled for decades. Pedro had crossed the line between thought and action, and once crossed, that line dissolved. It felt, in some dark way, inevitable. He later said he felt no satisfaction, only certainty. He believed he had corrected a wrong the world refused to fix. The boy returned home that night changed. He wasn't celebrated. He wasn't scolded. In truth, no one truly understood what had awakened in him. But Pedro knew. In that moment, he decided that he would become the judge of his own world, delivering punishment in the only language he believed the wicked understood. He was 14, and his legend had begun. The teenage vigilante. After the first killing, Pedro didn't collapse under fear or guilt as many might expect. Instead, he carried himself with a strange calmness, as though he had stepped into a role that had been waiting for him all along. The world around him continued with its normal rhythm, children walking to school, vendors calling out their prices, neighbors gossiping about the smallest things. But Pedro observed it all from a distance, standing slightly outside the frame. In his mind, he had crossed a boundary he could never return from, and now the world felt smaller, clearer, and far more dangerous. The police questioned him, but never suspected a teenager capable of such an act. Rumors swirled, of course, but no one imagined that the quiet boy with the scarred skull and sharp eyes could orchestrate something so cold. That misjudgment would become a pattern in Pedro's life. Adults consistently underestimating him, authorities overlooking him, criminals assuming he was harmless until it was too late. He moved through these blind spots like a ghost, watching and learning. But the ease of escaping suspicion didn't erase the turbulence unfolding at home. His father's violent temper had grown unpredictable, fueled by frustration and alcohol. Pedro felt torn between hatred and loyalty, emotions that roared inside him with equal force. Yet somewhere deep inside, a darker realization simmered that the most dangerous man in his life was not on the streets, but sitting at his own kitchen table. That knowledge twisted inside him, reshaping his ideas about justice and retribution. In the outskirts of town, Pedro found unsolicited guidance from the criminal underbelly that operated after dusk. He lingered near older men whose reputations were built on theft, intimidation, and survival. These weren't mentors in the traditional sense, but they spoke openly about the failures of law enforcement, the betrayals within families, and the importance of striking first. Pedro absorbed these lessons like a sponge, not because he admired these men, but because they confirmed what he already sensed. The world respected force more than virtue. By 16, Pedro began to develop a reputation, whispered rather than spoken, carried from ear to ear like a warning. People noticed the way he stared at men who mistreated the weak. They noticed how he stepped into dangerous situations without hesitation, as though conflict magnetized him. One incident defined this rising legend, a neighborhood bully known for harassing women and stealing from elderly residents. Pedro watched him for weeks before confronting him in a narrow alley, where the two exchanged words that no witness ever fully recalled. When the bully turned up severely injured, the whispers grew louder. What made Pedro different from common criminals was the structure of his anger. He didn't lash out randomly. His targets were chosen, studied, and delivered judgment with a sense of personal mission. In his mind, he wasn't a threat to innocent people, only to those who brought suffering to others. This mindset became the cornerstone of his vigilante identity. Whether society agreed or not didn't matter. He believed he understood the darkness of men better than the police ever could. As his reputation grew, so did his confidence. He moved with boldness, walking into bars and street corners where dangerous men gathered. He listened to conversations, memorized faces, and learned who hurt whom. Criminals began to fear him, not because of his size — he was still young, lean, and unassuming — but because of his intent. He didn't bluff, he didn't threaten, he acted, and those who crossed him learned that his sense of justice was terrifyingly literal. However, Pedro's actions drew the attention of gangs and local criminals who viewed him as unpredictable, uncontrollable, and bad for business. Many wanted him silenced before he destabilized the balance of power they depended on. They followed him, threatened him, and cornered him more than once. Each time Pedro escaped through instinct, speed, or sheer audacity. His life became a dance with danger, one misstep away from death, yet he moved with the confidence of someone who didn't fear the inevitable. Despite the rising threats, Pedro felt a sense of clarity about his purpose. In a world where the weak were constantly devoured, he saw himself as something different. Not a savior, but a counterweight. A force created by violence and shaped by injustice. He believed he was necessary, the product of a broken environment that created its own form of justice when the official system failed. By the time he turned 17, Pedro wasn't just a boy anymore. He was a name that traveled through the shadows. People who once ignored him now crossed the street when they saw him coming. Criminals who once boasted about their cruelty avoided his gaze. And somewhere in his mind, a dangerous conviction solidified. If the world continued to produce monsters, then he would dedicate his life to hunting them. Blood, betrayal, and the unthinkable. The year Pedro turned 18 marked a turning point so sharp it cut through the rest of his life like a blade. By then, he had already tasted the intoxication of power. Not the power of domination, but the power of retribution. Yet even with his rising reputation, Pedro carried one wound that refused to close. The violence he had endured inside his own home. Every bruise his mother hid beneath her clothes replayed in his memory. each one fueling a storm brewing inside him. And at the center of that storm stood his father, a man whose cruelty had built the foundation of Pedro's rage. The tipping point came on an afternoon that seemed ordinary to everyone except Pedro. He returned home to discover his mother crying. Not quietly, not in the defeated whisper he had grown used to, but with a raw despair that shook the walls. The argument had escalated, and this time the blows had been worse. Something broke inside Pedro that day. He walked outside, sat on the ground, and stared at the dusty earth as though he were communing with something deep and ancient within himself. He felt neither panic nor confusion, only clarity. In Pedro's mind, the earlier killings had been acts of necessity, of balancing scales. But now the scale stood inside his own home. His father, the man who should have protected him, had instead planted the seed of violence in him. Pedro believed the world had allowed his father to go unpunished for too long. And in that belief, he found his resolve. If justice truly meant anything, then it had to begin where his own suffering began. The confrontation unfolded not in a heat of impulse, but with the cold precision of a son who had already made peace with the consequences. Pedro entered the house and found his father seated, unaware of the storm approaching him. They exchanged words, short, heavy, and final. Witnesses would later say that Pedro didn't shout, didn't tremble, didn't waver. He moved with the quiet certainty of someone who had been preparing for this moment his entire life. When it was over, Pedro stood above the man who had tormented him for years. He didn't feel triumph. He didn't feel relief. What he felt was a strange, hollow justice, the kind that leaves the soul empty instead of healed. He later admitted that he had expected something transformative, something that would erase his pain. Instead, he felt only the truth. Violence, even when justified in his mind, could not rewrite the past. But the killing of his father set off a chain reaction. Word spread quickly, traveling through neighborhoods and into the ears of criminals who already feared Pedro. Some saw it as madness, others as inevitability. To Pedro, however, it was the closing of a chapter, the final severing of the boy he had been from the man he was becoming. He didn't flee afterward, he didn't hide. He walked away with the same calmness he had carried since his first act of vengeance, knowing the police would eventually come for him. And they did. Authorities captured him soon after, but Pedro didn't resist. In a way, he welcomed the arrest. It felt like the beginning of a new stage in his life, one where he would no longer walk the world as a hunted shadow, but as a man confronting the consequences of his convictions. Yet prison, as Pedro would soon discover, was not a place of punishment for men like him. It was a battlefield, one where the rules of the outside world no longer applied. On the way to jail, Pedro listened to the officers talk about him, unaware he understood every word. They spoke of him as though he were a curiosity, a strange story to recount at a bar. None of them realized that the quiet young man in the back of the vehicle had already memorized their faces, their tones, their judgments. The world had underestimated him too many times. In prison, that mistake would prove fatal for many. When Pedro arrived at the facility, the guards assumed the young man would crumble under pressure. But prisons in Brazil were worlds of their own, ecosystems of fear, alliances, betrayal, and codes older than any written law. Pedro entered not as prey but as a storm. Criminals who had terrorized communities for years sensed something different in him, something dangerous. He didn't posture or make threats. He simply observed, and for men who had spent their lives reading faces, his silence was the loudest warning of all. The moment Pedro stepped into his cell block marked the beginning of a legend that would echo through every prison in the country. Because in a place where cruelty reigned and predators fed on the weak, a new force had arrived, one who believed he had been forged for this environment. What came next would define the name Pedrinho Matador for generations, turning him from a boy driven by vengeance into a man ruled by a violent sense of purpose. The blood oath inside the prison walls. Night in Taubaté prison had its own weather, thick, metallic and hot, as if the concrete walls were sweating fear. Even the guards walked faster after sunset. On those nights, whispers followed Pedrinho like shadows. Men spoke his name with a strange mixture of dread and admiration. Some believed he carried a curse, others believed he carried justice, but everyone, absolutely everyone, knew that crossing him meant forfeiting your breath before dawn. And in the darkest corridors of that prison, Pedrinho was about to make a decision that would echo across Brazil for decades. It began with a rumor, as most prison wars do. A man had arrived, older, soft-spoken, eyes always lowered, the kind of shadow that tries to disappear into walls. But Pedrinho noticed him immediately. Not because the man was dangerous, but because the man pretended not to be. Pedrinho had an instinct for predators who wore sheep's clothing. And soon enough, the truth surfaced. The new inmate had been convicted of murdering a child. Panic sat quietly on the edges of Pedrinho's mind, not for himself, but for what he believed he had to do. Inside him lived a twisted code, one he never wrote, but followed with absolute devotion. Prisons are ecosystems. Predators, prey, parasites, kings, and in Taubaté, crimes against children ranked at the bottom, lower than snitches, lower than thieves, lower than monsters. Yet no one wanted to confront the newcomer, not because they respected him, but because they feared the chaos that might follow. But Pedrinho, he welcomed the chaos. He understood it, shaped it, thrived in it. And somewhere deep within that violent logic he called justice, he felt the familiar burn rise behind his ribs. This wasn't rage, it was purpose. Word reached him the next morning. The man was terrified, begging guards to move him. But Pedrinho didn't respond. He watched, he waited. He measured the man's fear, his lies, the tremor in his hands. It wasn't hatred that fueled Pedrinho. He didn't hate strangers. Hatred belonged to those who felt betrayed. What Pedrinho felt now was different, calculated, cold, ritualistic. He had always believed that some men had already surrendered their right to breathe. And in that prison he saw himself not as an inmate, but as the executor. The attack came without ceremony. Pedrinho approached him during breakfast, where the noise of cutlery became a convenient camouflage. The man froze, spoon in hand, unable to speak. Pedrinho sat across from him, leaned forward, and whispered a single question. A question that never left his lips without consequence. "Tell me what you did." The man trembled, denying everything. Pedrinho waited for a confession he knew would never come. And when the denial arrived, shaky, desperate, Pedrinho made his decision. The assault was swift, almost silent. A movement, a choke, a thud. The entire cafeteria froze. All eyes drifted to Pedrinho, and in those seconds he wasn't a man. He was an omen. The guards swarmed the hall, but no one tried to fight him. They dragged him away, shouting orders he didn't hear. Pedrinho's eyes remained locked on the lifeless body lying on the floor, not with satisfaction, but with a strange calmness, as if he had simply completed a task left undone by the courts. In the isolation cell, Pedrinho sat alone, but the quiet didn't bother him. Solitude had never frightened him. What frightened him was living in a world where certain men walked unpunished. And so, alone in the dim light, he made what would later be called his blood oath. He would hunt men like this inside every prison they placed him in, not for glory, not for fear, not even for revenge. He saw it as duty. From that day forward, prisons across Brazil would whisper about him long before he arrived. Guards tightened protocols. Inmates rehearsed apologies for crimes they never committed. The system tried to contain him, to isolate him, to bury him behind thicker walls and stricter rules. but they didn't understand the nature of what they were confronting. Pedrinho didn't need freedom to be dangerous. He didn't need weapons. He didn't even need allies. All he needed was proximity. He became a myth, not the kind built from exaggeration, but the kind forged in blood and repetition. Each transfer, each riot, each quarantine cell added another chapter to his reputation. And yet, beneath the brutality, there was something disturbingly methodical. Pedrinho was not chaotic. He was consistent, predictable in a way that made him even more feared. For in his mind, murder was not impulse. It was mathematics. And so, the legend of Pedrinho Matador spread far beyond the prison walls. Families discussed him at dinner tables. Newspapers wrote his name in bold. Politicians used him as proof of a broken system. But inside the cell, Pedrinho felt none of this. He didn't see a legend staring back at him. He saw a man who believed he had a job no one else would do, a job he embraced with terrifying conviction. The man who walked out but never left his shadow behind. When the gates finally opened for him, the world outside felt too bright, too loud, too fast. Pedrinho Matador stepped out with the stiff posture of a man who had spent more years behind bars than under the sun. Freedom didn't greet him. It examined him from a distance, unsure of how to approach a ghost like him. Reporters waited like vultures, cameras ready, hungry to capture the first breath of a man whose name had lived in headlines for decades. Pedrinho didn't smile. He simply blinked against the sunlight, wondering if the world had really changed, or if he had stayed frozen while time marched on without him. He walked with a strange calmness, as if the ground itself wasn't certain whether to support his weight. The asphalt felt foreign beneath his shoes. The breeze felt intrusive, touching his skin without permission. Cars passed with speed that made him instinctively tense, muscles trained for danger at every corner. Freedom, he realized, was not the absence of walls. It was the presence of uncertainties. And Pedrinho had never feared death, but uncertainty. That was different. It demanded adaptation, patience, and a silence he hadn't yet learned to keep. The first night outside was the hardest. The bed was soft, too soft. The room was quiet, unnervingly quiet. He missed the predictable hum of prison life, the clank of metal doors, the distant arguments, the rhythmic footsteps of guards. Out here, there were no patterns, no routines, he understood. Pedrinho lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering if he had genuinely been released or merely transferred to a different kind of confinement. In the darkness, the ghosts of the men he had killed wandered like uninvited visitors. But the world wanted something from him. It wanted explanations, interviews, justifications. Every journalist who sat across from him expected a monster, a confession dripping with theatrics. Instead, they found a man who spoke simply, almost quietly. Pedrinho didn't enjoy retelling the details. He didn't romanticize his past. But neither did he express regret in the way the world demanded. To him, remorse wasn't a currency he traded in. His logic, twisted, rigid, unbreakable, remained the same. He had done what he believed needed to be done. Yet Pedrinho was not immune to the idea of transformation. Somewhere in the fractured labyrinth of his life, he began to understand that survival outside prison required a new version of himself, one he had never been allowed to practice. People were afraid of him, fascinated by him, curious about him. He became a symbol whether he liked it or not, a cautionary tale, a walking reminder of a Brazil that had allowed violence to shape its children. And reluctantly, Pedrinho stepped into this strange role, speaking about crime, about consequences, about choices. Not as a saint, not as a reformed hero, but as a man carrying scars that could speak louder than any sermon. Still, there were nights when he felt the old tension rise, that instinctual sharpness, that hunter's awareness. Prison had taught him to measure every movement, every face, every breath around him. Freedom required him to unlearn that vigilance. But instincts don't vanish. They go quiet and wait. Pedrinho walked through streets where no one recognized him, yet he scanned every alley, every doorway. He wasn't searching for danger. He was searching for the version of himself who once ruled those shadows. What the world never understood was that Pedrinho didn't crave violence outside prison. He had no desire to return to who he once was. But he also knew a truth that made people uncomfortable. The man he had been in those cells couldn't be erased, only contained, guided, redirected. His past wasn't a chain. It was a second skin, one he carried even when no one could see it. In interviews, people often asked him if he feared being harmed after everything he had done. Pedrinho always answered the same way, with a faint, almost ironic smile. If someone comes for me, I'll see it before they do. It wasn't a threat, it was a fact. A survival instinct honed through decades of living in the most dangerous environments imaginable. Even free, he lived as if danger respected him enough to call ahead before visiting. Life outside never fully embraced him, and he never fully embraced it. He existed in the space between legend and man, between myth and flesh. Pedrinho learned to navigate this blurred identity, aware that the world saw him through a lens he could never clean. Some saw a monster, some saw a broken product of a brutal childhood, and some, disturbingly, saw a folk hero, a vigilante shaped by circumstance rather than choice. But deep inside, Pedrinho knew the truth. He was neither hero nor demon. He was a man molded by violence, sharpened by survival, and haunted by the echo of every decision he had ever made. Freedom had given him a chance to rewrite his ending, but it could never rewrite his beginning. And so he walked through life like a shadow without a wall, a legend without a home, a name the world could never quite decide how to judge, a name that outlived the man. Pedrinho Matador's story is not one of glory, nor redemption, nor simple villainy. It is the unsettling portrait of what a human being can become when violence is the first language they ever learn. His life carved a scar across Brazil, one that forced the country to confront its prisons, its laws, its failures, and the brutal environments capable of creating predators from children. Whether he walked free or remained behind bars, Pedrinho carried the weight of every act he committed, every judgment the world handed him, and every shadow he left behind. Some remember him as a monster. Others, disturbingly, admire the twisted code he lived by. But beyond all interpretations lies a single truth. Pedrinho Matador is a man shaped by a world that did not protect him, educate him, or guide him before it feared him. His legacy is not a path to follow. It is a warning, a reminder that violence creates more violence, and that without intervention, the cycle becomes a blueprint for the next generation of forgotten children. As his story closes and your screen fades to black, remember this. Legends are easy to romanticize, but lives like his are built from pain, loss, and consequences that never truly disappear. If you made it to the end, make sure to subscribe, leave a like, and comment your country and city, because stories like this hit differently depending on where you're watching from. And in the next episode, we continue uncovering the darkest chapters of humanity's history, one name at a time.